What happens when two powerhouse personalities clash on live television in a way that nobody saw coming? The tension in the studio was already thick before Queen Latifah even took her seat at the table on The View. Joy Behar had been making pointed comments all week about celebrities who speak out on political issues without, in her opinion, having the credentials to do so. Little did anyone know that Queen Latifah had been watching every single episode, and she was not happy about the subtle digs that seemed aimed directly at her recent advocacy work. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that had social media buzzing for weeks, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below with your thoughts on celebrity activism. Now, let's get into what really went down. The show opened normally enough with the usual banter between the hosts about current events. Sarah Haynes was discussing a recent charity gala when Joy interrupted with her signature bluntness. You know what I'm tired of hearing about? These celebrities thinking they know everything about politics and social issues just because they have a platform. Half of them didn't even finish high school, but suddenly they're experts on healthcare reform and foreign policy. Whoopi Goldberg shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly sensing where this was heading. Joy, I think people have a right to use their voice regardless of their educational background. Oh, please, Joy shot back, waving her hand dismissively. When someone becomes famous for singing songs or making movies, that doesn't automatically make them qualified to tell the rest of us how to vote or what to think about complex issues. It's almost insulting to people who actually studied these things. The other hosts exchanged glances, but before anyone could respond, there was a commotion from the entrance. Queen Latifah walked onto the set earlier than scheduled, her face set in an expression that immediately caught everyone's attention. She wasn't supposed to appear until after the commercial break, but clearly something had changed. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Queen Latifah said, her voice carrying across the studio with unmistakable authority. "But I couldn't sit in the green room and listen to another second of this conversation without addressing it directly." Joy's eyebrows shot up, clearly caught off guard. "Queen Latifah, we weren't expecting you until..." "When, Joy?" "Until you finished explaining why people like me should stay in our lane." Queen Latifah moved toward the table with purpose, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. "Because from what I just heard, it sounds like you have some very specific opinions about celebrities who dare to speak up about issues that affect their communities." The audience fell silent, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Whoopi tried to interject. "Ladies, maybe we should." "No, Whoopi. Let's not maybe anything," Queen Latifah said, finally taking her seat but keeping her eyes locked on Joy. "I want to hear Joy explain exactly which celebrities she's talking about, because if we're going to have this conversation, let's have it honestly and openly, not through coded language and passive-aggressive comments." Joy straightened in her chair, her defensive instincts kicking in. "I wasn't talking about anyone specifically, Queen Latifah. I was making a general observation about the trend of celebrity political commentary." "Were you now?" Queen Latifah's voice carried a dangerous edge. Because funny thing about general observations, they usually come from specific examples. So tell me, Joy, what specific examples led you to this general conclusion that celebrities should stick to entertaining and leave the thinking to others? The camera operators scrambled to capture every angle of this unexpected confrontation. Sarah Haynes looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair, while Sunny Hostin watched with the fascination of someone witnessing a masterclass in verbal sparring. Joy cleared her throat, clearly realizing she was in deeper water than she had anticipated. "Look, I think there's a difference between having opinions and presenting yourself as an authority on subjects you haven't formally studied." "Formally studied," Queen Latifah repeated slowly, her tone making those words sound almost insulting. "Joy, tell me about your formal studies in political science. Tell me about your degree in international relations. Tell me about your extensive background in constitutional law that qualifies you to sit here every day and share your opinions on everything from healthcare to foreign policy." The studio audience could sense the shift in energy. This wasn't going to be a friendly celebrity interview. This was becoming a confrontation that would define both women's legacies in daytime television. Joy's face flushed slightly as she realized the trap she had walked into. "I've been a comedian and a talk show host for decades. I've interviewed politicians, covered elections." "Ah," Queen Latifah interrupted, holding up a finger. "So, experience in the field counts for something then? Interesting. Because I've been using my platform to advocate for social justice issues for over 30 years. I've worked directly with community organizations, funded educational programs, and yes, I've also interviewed politicians and covered social issues. But somehow, your experience makes you qualified to have opinions, while mine makes me an overstepping celebrity. Whoopi attempted another intervention. I think we're all passionate about the issues we care about. Passionate, yes, Queen Latifah agreed, but her focus remained on Joy. But there's a difference between passion and condescension. There's a difference between healthy debate and dismissive commentary designed to silence voices that might not align with your particular worldview. Joy leaned forward, her own combative nature finally emerging fully. I'm not trying to silence anyone. I'm saying that with great platforms come great responsibility, and that responsibility includes acknowledging the limits of your expertise. The limits of my expertise, Queen Latifah repeated, her voice rising slightly. Joy, let me tell you about my expertise. I grew up in East Orange, New Jersey, in a single-parent household. I've lived through the war on drugs, the crack epidemic, the systematic underfunding of public schools in urban communities. I've watched friends and family members struggle with poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to health care. The passion in her voice was unmistakable, and even Joy seemed taken aback by the raw emotion behind the words. But beyond my lived experience, Queen Latifah continued, I've also spent decades working with organizations that address these issues. I've sat in meetings with policymakers. I've funded research. I've traveled to communities across this country to understand the real impact of the policies we're debating. So tell me again about the limits of my expertise. Joy opened her mouth to respond. But Queen Latifah wasn't finished. And let's be clear about something else, Joy. When you make these broad statements about celebrities staying in their lane, you're not just talking about some abstract group of people. You're talking about individuals who have used their success to amplify voices that might not otherwise be heard. You're talking about people who have turned privilege into purpose. The tension in the studio was palpable. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this historic confrontation continue to unfold. Joy finally found her voice again, but there was a defensive edge that hadn't been there before. Queen Latifah, I respect your activism and your background, but that doesn't mean every celebrity who speaks out has done the same level of work or preparation that you have. And there it is, Queen Latifah said, leaning back in her chair with a knowing look. The classic deflection. Instead of addressing the broader implications of what you said, you're now trying to separate me from other celebrities. As if that makes your original statement any less problematic. Sunny Hostin, who had been watching this exchange with growing interest, finally spoke up. Joy, I think what Queen Latifah is pointing out is that your comments seem to paint all celebrity activism with the same brush. Thank you, Sunny, Queen Latifah said, nodding appreciatively. Because that's exactly what this is about. It's about the assumption that fame somehow disqualifies you from having informed opinions about the world around you. It's about the idea that entertainment and intelligence are mutually exclusive. Joy shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that the conversation had moved beyond her control. Look, I didn't mean to imply that all celebrities are uninformed. I was making a point about the responsibility that comes with having a large platform. Were you, though? Queen Latifah's voice took on an almost clinical tone. Because what I heard was you suggesting that celebrities who speak out on political issues don't have the credentials to do so. You specifically mentioned people who didn't finish high school, as if formal education is the only path to understanding or wisdom. The camera caught Joy's face tightening as she realized her earlier words were being dissected piece by piece. That's particularly interesting coming from someone in your position, Queen Latifah continued. Because this show, The View, has built its entire brand on the idea that different perspectives and backgrounds bring value to public discourse. Yet somehow, when those different perspectives come from the entertainment industry, they're suddenly less valid. Whoopi tried once more to steer the conversation. I think we can all agree that diverse voices are important in any discussion. Can we though, Whoopi? Queen Latifah turned slightly to address her, but her words were clearly still directed at Joy. Because what I'm hearing suggests that some voices are more welcome than others, depending on where they come from. Joy's patience was clearly wearing thin. You're twisting my words, Queen Latifah. I never said entertainment industry voices weren't welcome. I said people should be aware of their limitations. My limitations? Queen Latifah repeated, her tone growing colder. Joy, let me ask you something. When you discuss healthcare policy on this show, do you preface your comments by acknowledging that you're not a doctor? When you talk about education reform, do you remind viewers that you're not an educator? When you discuss foreign policy, do you mention that you've never worked in the State Department? The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. That's different, Joy protested. But her voice lacked conviction. How is it different? Queen Latifah pressed. How is your voice on complex issues different from mine other than the fact that you have a daily television show and I happen to also make music and movies? Sarah Haynes, who had been unusually quiet, attempted to lighten the mood. I think we all bring different experiences to these conversations, and that's what makes them valuable. But Queen Latifah wasn't ready to let the tension ease. Sarah, you're absolutely right. Different experiences are valuable, but Joy seems to think that some experiences are more valuable than others, and I'd like to understand what criteria she's using to make that determination. Joy's defensive walls were fully up. Now, I'm not ranking experiences, Queen Latifah. I'm talking about expertise and qualifications. Expertise and qualifications? Queen Latifah amused. Joy, tell me, what qualifies someone to speak about poverty? Is it a degree in economics, or is it having lived it? What qualifies someone to discuss racial discrimination? Is it academic study, or is it having experienced it firsthand? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Joyce seemed to realize she was trapped between competing definitions of authority. Both experiences matter, Joyce said carefully, clearly trying to find safer ground. Both experiences matter, Queen Latifah agreed. So why then, when celebrities draw on their lived experiences and combine them with research, advocacy work, and direct community engagement? Are they somehow less qualified to speak than television hosts who draw on their professional experiences? Sunny leaned forward, clearly engaged by the philosophical implications of the debate. That's a really important distinction, Queen Latifah. The assumption that formal credentials are the only legitimate source of authority. Exactly, Queen Latifah said, her voice gaining momentum. And what's particularly troubling about that assumption is how it's applied. When celebrities support causes that align with mainstream thinking, suddenly they're praised for using their platform responsibly. But when they challenge systems or speak out on controversial issues, suddenly they need to stay in their lane. Joy's face showed a flash of recognition, as if she realized the conversation had moved into territory she hadn't anticipated. I think you're reading too much into what I said. Am I though, Joy? Or am I reading exactly what you meant? Queen Latifah's directness was cutting through every attempt at diplomatic deflection. Because here's what I heard and what thousands of viewers heard. I heard you suggest that people in entertainment don't have the right to speak authoritatively on issues that affect their communities and their country. The studio fell silent again, the weight of the accusations settling over everyone present. And what's particularly ironic, Queen Latifah continued, is that this conversation is happening on a show that regularly features celebrities as guests specifically to discuss current events and social issues. So either the View is complicit in giving unqualified people a platform, or your criticism applies selectively based on criteria you haven't clearly articulated. Whoopi, clearly sensing that the situation was escalating beyond typical television discourse, tried to find common ground. I think we all want people to be thoughtful about how they use their influence. Thoughtful, yes, Queen Latifah agreed. But Joy's comments weren't about thoughtfulness. They were about qualification and authority, and I'd like to understand what makes her qualified to determine who gets to speak and who doesn't. Joy's face was flushed now, her discomfort evident to everyone watching. That's not what I was doing. Then what were you doing, Joy? Queen Latifah's question was direct and unavoidable because from where I'm sitting, it sounded exactly like you were drawing lines around who gets to have opinions and who doesn't, based on your personal assessment of their credentials. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point, and it was clear that this conversation was far from over. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Joy finally responded, her voice tight with frustration. You know what, Queen Latifah? Fine. You want to know what I really think? I think some celebrities use social causes as publicity stunts. And I think the public deserves to know the difference between genuine advocacy and performative activism. Queen Latifah's eyes flashed with something dangerous. There it is. The real issue. You're not concerned about qualifications or credentials, Joy. You're making judgments about people's motivations, and you're doing it from your seat at this table without knowing anything about their actual work or commitment. I have every right to my opinions. Joy shot back, her own temper finally showing. and I have every right to express skepticism when I see celebrities jumping on bandwagons. Bandwagons? Queen Latifah repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. Joy, let me tell you about bandwagons. I've been advocating for LGBTQ rights since the 1990s, when it was career suicide in hip-hop. I've been speaking out about police brutality since before it was trending on social media. I've been funding education programs in underserved communities since I made my first real money in this business. She leaned forward, her intensity palpable. So tell me, Joy, which bandwagon exactly do you think I jumped on? Joy opened her mouth, but seemed to realize she had walked into another trap. The specificity of Queen Latifah's examples made it impossible to dismiss her work as performative. And here's what's really interesting about your bandwagon theory, Queen Latifah continued, not giving Joy a chance to recover. It assumes that caring about social justice issues is somehow trendy or temporary. It assumes that people can't genuinely be moved by injustice or inequality unless they're doing it for publicity. Sunny nodded, clearly following Queen Latifah's logic. That's a pretty cynical view of human nature. It is cynical, Queen Latifah agreed, her gaze still locked on Joy. But more than that, it's a way of dismissing voices without having to engage with their actual arguments. Instead of debating the merit of what someone is saying, you question their motives for saying it. Joy's defensive posture had shifted to something more combative. So, I'm supposed to just accept everything any celebrity says about any issue without question. Did I say that, Joy? Queen Latifah's tone was almost conversational now, which made her words even more cutting. Did anyone at this table suggest that critical thinking should be abandoned? Or are you creating a straw man argument because your original position is impossible to defend? The audience was completely engaged now, leaning forward in their seats as they watched this intellectual chess match unfold. What I'm suggesting, Queen Latifah continued, is that you apply the same standards to everyone. If you're going to question celebrity voices on social issues, then question all voices equally. But what actually happens is selective skepticism, based on whether someone agrees with your worldview. Whoopi tried once more to mediate. I think healthy skepticism is good for any public discourse. Healthy skepticism, absolutely. Queen Latifah agreed. But Joy's comments weren't about healthy skepticism. They were about categorical dismissal based on profession. There's a difference between saying, let's examine this person's arguments, and saying, this person shouldn't have arguments because they're an entertainer. Joy's frustration was becoming more evident. You're putting words in my mouth that I never said. Am I? Queen Latifah tilted her head slightly. Because what I heard you say was that celebrities think they know everything about politics and social issues just because they have a platform, and that it's almost insulting to people who actually studied these things. Those were your exact words, Joy. Not my interpretation, your words. The precision of the quote clearly rattled Joy, who seemed surprised that her earlier comments were being repeated back to her verbatim. And the implication of those words, Queen Latifah continued relentlessly, is that having studied something formally is more valuable than having lived it, experienced it, or worked within it. It's academic elitism disguised as reasonable discourse. Sarah Haynes looked uncomfortable as the conversation grew more intense. Maybe we can find some middle ground here. But Queen Latifah wasn't interested in middle ground. Sarah, some conversations don't have middle ground. Some conversations are about fundamental respect for different types of knowledge and different paths to understanding. And Joy's position fundamentally disrespects the validity of lived experience and practical advocacy work. Joy's patience had clearly reached its limit. You know what, Queen Latifah? You came on this show looking for a fight, and you found one. But don't pretend this is about some high-minded principle. This is about you being offended that someone dared to question celebrity activism. Queen Latifah smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. There we go. When all else fails, attack the person instead of addressing the argument. Very professional, Joy. Don't lecture me about professionalism. Joy snapped. You're the one who stormed onto this set before your scheduled time to pick a fight. I came onto this set to address comments that were clearly aimed at discrediting the work that I and others do. Queen Latifah replied calmly. If you want to call that picking a fight, that says more about how you view accountability than it does about my intentions. The tension in the studio had reached a fever pitch. Sunny looked fascinated. Sarah looked terrified. And Whoopi looked like she was calculating whether to cut to commercial or let this historic confrontation continue. And let's be absolutely clear about something else. Queen Latifah continued, her voice rising again. I didn't come here to defend celebrity activism in general. I came here to defend the principle that voices shouldn't be silenced based on irrelevant criteria. Whether someone is a teacher, a plumber, a scientist, or yes, an entertainer, their arguments should be judged on their merit, not their job title. Joy leaned back in her chair, clearly struggling to find firm ground in this debate. Fine, but with great platforms come great responsibilities. Great responsibilities, yes, Queen Latifah agreed immediately. And one of those responsibilities is using your platform thoughtfully and with preparation. Another responsibility is not using your platform to silence other voices or to gatekeep discourse based on your personal biases. The implication was clear, and Joy's face showed that she understood she was being accused of exactly that. So tell me, Joy, Queen Latifah continued, her tone becoming almost clinical again. What responsibility are you taking for using your platform to discourage civic engagement from entire groups of people based solely on their profession? Joy's face went through a series of expressions as she processed Queen Latifah's final question. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or wave away. For several long seconds, she seemed to be weighing her options, calculating whether to double down or retreat. That's not what I was doing, Joy said finally. But her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier in the conversation. Isn't it, though? Queen Latifah pressed, sensing weakness. Because discouraging civic engagement is exactly what happens when you tell people they're not qualified to have opinions about issues that affect them. When you create arbitrary barriers to public discourse, you're not protecting democracy. You're undermining it. Whoopi finally found an opening to speak. I think we all want people to be engaged citizens regardless of their profession. Do we though, Whoopi? Queen Latifah turned to face her colleague directly. Because what I've heard today suggests that some of us think citizenship comes with professional requirements that were never mentioned in the Constitution. The audience stirred, clearly recognizing the broader implications of what was being discussed. Joy made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. Look, all I was saying is that people should be responsible when they use their platforms to discuss complex issues. And all I'm saying, Joy, is that responsibility is a two-way street, Queen Latifah replied immediately. It's the responsibility of people with platforms to speak thoughtfully. And it's the responsibility of media personalities not to use their platforms to silence voices based on prejudice and professional bias. The word prejudice landed like a physical blow, and Joy's face flushed deeper than it had at any point during the confrontation. I am not prejudiced against celebrities, Joy said, her voice rising defensively. Then explain to me the logic behind your position, Queen Latifah challenged. Explain to me why formal education in political science makes someone more qualified to discuss poverty than someone who grew up poor. Explain to me why studying international relations in a classroom makes someone more qualified to discuss discrimination than someone who has lived it. Sunny, who had been following every word of this exchange, leaned forward. That's the heart of it, isn't it? Different types of knowledge and different types of authority. Exactly, Queen Latifah said, nodding appreciatively at Sunny while keeping her focus on Joy. And what Joy is doing, whether she realizes it or not, is privileging one type of knowledge over another based not on relevance or accuracy, but on social acceptability. Joy's jaw tightened. That's not true. Then tell me this, Joy. Queen Latifah said, her voice taking on a tone of finality. Have you ever questioned the qualifications of a college professor who appears on news shows to discuss politics? Have you ever suggested that journalists should stay in their lane when they offer analysis of social issues? Have you ever implied that politicians who discuss entertainment industry matters are overstepping their expertise? The specificity of the questions made it clear that Queen Latifah had thought deeply about these issues, and Joy's silence was more telling than any answer could have been. The reason you haven't questioned those voices, Queen Latifah continued, is because they fit your definition of who gets to speak authoritatively. But that definition isn't based on actual qualifications or relevant experience. It's based on social hierarchy and professional prejudice. Sarah Haynes made one last attempt to find diplomatic ground. I think we can all agree that diverse perspectives make for richer conversations. Sarah, that's the point exactly. Queen Latifah said, her intensity not diminishing. Diverse perspectives do make for richer conversations, but Joy's position actively works against diversity by creating barriers to participation based on irrelevant criteria. Joy finally seemed to find some fire again. You know what, Queen Latifah? You've made your point. You disagree with what I said? Fine, but don't pretend this conversation is going to change anything. Queen Latifah smiled, and this time there was something almost triumphant in the expression. Joy, this conversation has already changed something. It's exposed the double standards that exist in how we evaluate public voices. It's shown viewers exactly how certain gatekeepers operate when they're challenged directly. The audience began to murmur, sensing that something significant was happening beyond typical daytime television drama. And most importantly, Queen Latifah continued, her voice carrying across the studio with complete authority. It's demonstrated that when people with platforms use them responsibly, they can hold other people with platforms accountable for how they use theirs. Whoopi, recognizing that the conversation had reached a natural conclusion, attempted to wrap things up. Well, this has certainly been an engaging discussion about media responsibility and civic engagement. But Queen Latifah wasn't quite finished. It has been engaging, Whoopi, and I hope it's been educational for viewers who might not have realized how easily voices can be dismissed or marginalized by people who claim to support diverse discourse, while actually working to limit it. Joy sat back in her chair, clearly defeated, but trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. I guess we'll have to agree to disagree. No, Joy, Queen Latifah said firmly. We don't have to agree to disagree. We have to agree that all voices deserve to be evaluated fairly regardless of their professional background. We have to agree that lived experience matters as much as formal education. We have to agree that civic engagement should be encouraged, not discouraged based on arbitrary professional barriers. The finality in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a request for agreement. It was a statement of principle that transcended personal disagreement. And if we can't agree on those basic democratic principles, Queen Latifah concluded, looking directly into the camera, then we have much bigger problems than celebrity activism. The studio fell completely silent. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure how to transition from this moment of raw honesty back to typical television programming. Queen Latifah stood up slowly, her presence commanding attention one final time. Thank you for having me on the show. I hope this conversation encourages viewers to think critically about who gets to speak, who gets to listen, and who gets to decide the difference. As she walked off the set, the camera captured the faces of the remaining hosts, each processing what they had just witnessed in their own way. Joy looked stunned, Whoopi looked thoughtful, Sunny looked impressed, and Sarah looked like she had just watched a master class in public discourse. The confrontation was over, but its impact was just beginning to be felt. Social media exploded within minutes, with clips of the exchange going viral across every platform. Think pieces were written, debates were sparked, and conversations about celebrity activism, media responsibility, and democratic discourse dominated headlines for weeks. What had started as a routine celebrity appearance had become a defining moment in daytime television history and a powerful demonstration of what happens when intelligence, preparation, and principle collide with prejudice and gatekeeping on live television. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of the most explosive confrontations in recent television history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments. Do you think celebrities have a responsibility to speak out on social issues, or should they stick to entertainment?